video, we are going to talk about populations. So just as a little reminder, a population is a group of organisms of the same species living in the same place at the same time. So here again, we have those delicious looking pigs. And so these particular pigs are a representative of a population. So same species living in the same place at the same time. Now, there's 5 key characteristics to populations, and this is how scientists and people who study populations, these are the characteristics that they look at. So the first one is density, and the density characteristic is the number of individuals that live in a given area. This is important because in, let's say, an area of the same size, if there's only small population, let's say 5 individuals of a species in one area versus, let's say, 50 in a different area, the density says a lot about the ecosystem and the environment itself. A second key characteristic that scientists look at is spatial distribution. And this is the way the individuals of a population are arranged in space. And there's several factors that affect this dispersion. It could be a distribution of food, could be because of abiotic conditions. Perhaps there's a large river in the middle of, or a pond or something that's smack dab in the middle of the area, or perhaps there's the existence of parasites or predators. So if you take a look at these pictures, we have 3 different types of spatial distributions. And on your notes, there's a place for you to draw this and to make sure that you write down these 3 particular names. So the first one is random. Of course, the little dots here are just randomly spaced out. There's really no pattern to it. A second type of spatial distribution is uniform. And I know you can't really see it here, but there is a very nice pattern here. These are clearly spaced out apart from each other, and there is a pattern. So this is uniform. We also see a third type of spatial distribution, which is clumped. And so you see a little population here, a little bit over here, a little bit over here. So these 3 types of spatial distributions are important to understand because, again, perhaps there's different factors that are creating these types of distribution. A third key characteristic is size. Now, the size is the number of individuals in the population. Now, I do want to point out, I'm going to quickly go back to the other slide, that this looks like density. So I wanted to make sure that we understand the difference between the two. Density is the number of individuals that live in a given area. So this is all about area. So the number of individuals in a given area versus size, which is the number of individuals in the population. So when we're talking about density, we really are talking about the number of individuals in a certain area. So the areas are comparable. In this particular case of size, it's not necessarily just about the number or about the area itself. It really is about the number of individuals. A fourth key characteristic is age structure, and this is the number of males and females of a given age in the population. Now, this is important because, especially during human populations, and we'll see an age structure diagram a little bit later, it's important to understand the age range of some of these individuals because if you have an elderly population or an older population, they tend not to be able to reproduce versus a younger population is able to reproduce. So there's a lot of factors that go into age structure. And the last one here is growth rate. And now growth rate determines whether the size of the population will increase, will decrease, or stay the same. And we'll talk about some of those factors of growth rate in a few seconds. And here we go, like I said. So factors that affect the population size. Now, this is about increasing, decreasing, or staying the same in a population. So these particular factors of increase, so if we see an increase in population, they could be due to natality, which is the birth rate, or immigration, and this is the movement of individuals into an area. So you may have heard a lot about immigration in politics and government types of immigration, and that is where an outside population moves in. But that also affects the population size by increasing it. So these two factors affect population size by increasing birth rate and immigration. When we see a decrease in population size, that could be due to mortality, which is the death rate, or emigration, and that's the opposite of immigration. This is where individuals or populations move out of an area. So let's say we were to move to Canada, for instance, that would be an emigration from the United States versus an immigration where we have Canada moving into the US. So that's the difference here. Now, we also can see carrying capacity, and carrying capacity also are that's a factor that can affect population size. Now, carrying capacity is very important to understand for an ecosystem. And this is the maximum number of individuals of a particular species that a particular environment can support. Now, carrying capacity is based all on resources in a particular area. So if we had plenty of water, food, and shelter for individual species, whatever it is that they require, then we could possibly have large numbers of populations in that area. Like let's say, for example, deer. If we have a lot of not a lot of predators, we have a lot of water and food supply for deer, we could see large amounts of deer. However, if the resources are not there, then carrying capacity has been reached, and it doesn't matter how many individuals of the population, some are not going to get those resources. So it's that carrying capacity is needing to be understood because that's all about the resources that the particular area can hold. Now, when we're talking about growth rate, we tend to talk about them in two types of growth. So we have exponential growth and logistics growth. So we're going to take a look at different graphs for each one to kind of see what the difference is. Now, the first one, exponential population growth, this is where populations will grow when birth rate is greater than the death rate. So more births are taking place than deaths. Now, if the rate of growth is constant over time, the population will exhibit exponential growth. Now, in this particular graph, you see this kind of like this J-shaped curve. And what happens is we have this, grow, 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 and boom, it just sort of exponentially grows, meaning that perhaps every day or every other day, we see a doubling of the population. So if we see here, we have the number of months down here on the bottom, and this is representing from 1 month to 25 months. So that's basically 2 years. And we have the mice population over on the side, and this is all about millions of mice. So if you notice between months 1 and 19, we don't see a whole lot of growth here, but notice that around month 19, that population just explodes. And so this is what's called a J curve or exponential growth. Um, who knows if this particular graph will continue to shoot up or if they'll continue to perhaps kind of flatten out. And we'll see what that is in a second. We also see something called the logistics curve, and this is where the population's growth slows or stops following exponential growth. So you kind of see here, if you notice, this particular curve right here looks very similar to that exponential curve we just talked about. But what happens here is that it kind of lags out. So perhaps we've hit capacity, carrying capacity, perhaps natality rate is now less than mortality. Perhaps the emigration has exceeded immigration, or perhaps we have other factors, and those factors are called limiting factors. We'll talk about those in the next slides. But in a logistics curve, or as it's known as an S curve, this is something that where the population will kind of slow down and it'll even off after a while. Now, in this particular case, it just says population, so who knows exactly what the population is, but notice the time period, similar to the past one that we just saw, we have an exponential growth, and then about month 15 or so, we start to see it die or slow off of this, and it just sort of plateaus. So the difference between exponential logistics curve is really this right here. In the logistics curve, we see a plateau. Now, in your notes, I want you to jot down some of your ideas of what some limiting factors might be. So, limiting factors in an ecosystem are factors that control the growth of a population. So this definitely, we could see limiting factors in many different ways, but jot down some limiting factors that you think might be to control a population of deer, both biotic or living factors and abiotic or non-living factors. So pause this video, take a moment, and jot down some of your ideas. What are some of the limiting factors controlling a deer population, both biotic and abiotic? So after your list, hopefully you have some of the things that I have, but if not, go ahead and jot down these particular ideas. So there are some things, some limiting factors that can control a population of deer. So a list that I came up with, biotic factors, could be predation. Who knows what particular predators are out there looking for deer. Food availability, that's a huge one. So food is very, very important. Competition. Of course, deer compete, so different populations of deer will compete for the available resources. Disease, and I have it under biotic, but it could be under abiotic if it definitely was a virus, let's say. Viruses are not living, but diseases in the form of bacteria are. And parasites. Parasites are biotic factors that could limit a population or control it. Some abiotic factors, we have temperature, of course, or weather, flooding, hurricanes, and water was added as well because that's definitely an abiotic factor. If you have anything, definitely keep it in there. If you have any questions with it, just let me know. So when we're talking about a human population, um, we have about 8 million people, if not more, at this point, or we're coming up about 8 million as of this particular video. So um, it's it's very concerning for the planet Earth how many humans are actually living on the surface at the moment. So environmental conditions previously kept the size of human populations relatively constant and small. And typically, we were always below the environment's carrying capacity. But we have learned to alter the carrying capacity of our environment in a lot of different ways. So, water sources, we've collected them, we've made them. Um, Different sorts of food sources. Of course, we now utilize tons of land in order to make food. Shelter, of course, we can build by chopping down forests and making cement and all sorts of things. So, we have learned how to alter carrying capacity. So as a human population, we have exceeded the carrying capacity of the planet. Now, this is just a quick, a very old graph, but you can kind of see where we're going with this. Um, if you notice the time down here and over on this side is our human population. So time-wise, we've kind of kept below 1 million people up until about, hmm, can't really say, but definitely, 1950s, our population has begun to explode. You can probably take a guess at why human population has grown exponentially since then. We have better food, we have better medicines, we have a lot of different things than previous populations of humans had, and we've learned to adapt in many environments. And our population has just exceeded. We're up to 7 billion people, and it's only growing. I believe we've passed that 7 mark already, and we're headed to the 8 billion mark. So definitely keep our eyes open for that specific number, and I'll probably mention that in class. So this is the age structure that I mentioned earlier, and age structure is something that we should see as very balanced, and we should see a pre-productive, reproductive, and post-reproductive ages being approximately equal. And this represents kind of an age structure diagram for three different countries around the globe. So this particular one here in the middle, this is us in the United States. And notice that there is a slow growth, meaning that we don't have everything is almost equal. It's not going slow or fast one way or another. But pre-productive ages, if you notice, or pre-reproductive, is about ages 0 to 19. 20 to 44 is considered reproductive age, and then 45 all the way up to 80 plus. That is post reproductive. And what we see in this reproductive age is this is where typically most of our offspring is born with parents of these ages. Now, of course, that's not true in all cases, but you'll see whatever patterns in the particular countries. Now, on the right, we have negative growth. So we actually have less people in the reproductive and pre-reproductive age than we see in post-reproductive age. This means that their population will probably start to decrease here in Germany. Whereas in Kenya, notice this is completely skewed. It's definitely not equal at all. Notice that we see up here in the post-reproductive very few older people. So post-reproductive, we see very few, but in the reproductive and pre-reproductive, we see tons of people. So this means that their population is rapidly growing because you have a lot of people in the reproductive stage only being able to have more offspring. So in these three cases, you can kind of see a difference in growth patterns. Again, we sort of want them to be as equal as possible, but of course that doesn't always happen in different countries around the world.